Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Book Talk. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Kathleen Denly, and I've got her newest book right here, Murmur in the Mudcaves. Now, this is her fourth full-length novel. She also has a couple of novellas in this series as well. And Kathleen, I want to give you just a moment to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump right into talking about your books.
Hi, great. Hi, I'm Kathleen Denly. I write historical Christian romance, and I'm a happily married mother of 4. I used to live in San Diego County for about 20 years or so, and now I'm up in Central California in the Sierra Nevada foothills.
And I just am, part of me is kind of jealous because I live in like the flatlands of Indiana, surrounded by cornfields, and you're up by Yosemite. So I think you probably have the nicer location. It's got to be amazing to live in the foothills of the mountains.
It is really beautiful here. And actually, one of the reasons we moved here is for the natural beauty. I just find that it feeds my creative soul. I just love spending time in God's nature. It's very soothing. It's very inspiring.
I love that. And I find that I'm the same way. Like when I get kind of empty and I'm like, I need something to fill up my creativity, I find that for me, it's the mountains. My husband's always teasing me. He's like, oh, let's go to the beach. And I'm like, yeah, no, I much prefer the mountains. Mountains kind of play into your books. Now, is that part of why you moved to the Sierra Nevadas? Is it because you already loved them and it's kind of a setting for your books? Or was it a long love that then became kind of a hook for your writing?
So this particular area, we've actually been coming to for family vacation off and on since our first anniversary. We came here for our first anniversary. And so we just fell in love with the area. The setting of Murmur in the Mudcaves actually has more to do with where I lived in high school. I went to high school in the high desert, and the valley, the desert mountain valley in which I set my fictional ranch is an actual place, not where I went to high school, but it's also high desert. And so there was a lot about the setting that I have a lot of experience with and really enjoyed. Actually, my first job was with the Youth Conservation Corps in Joshua Tree National Park. And so I've actually worked with building things from stone and just physically getting my hands dirty in the desert. And so it was really fun to kind of go back and revisit those memories.
That is so fun. So when you're coming up with a series like this one, because this is the fourth book, what do you start with? Do you start with your plot, with your characters? What's kind of that Genesis moment, that spark that gets you going and goes, oh my gosh, there's a whole story here?
Yeah, it's funny because I actually wrote Waltz in the Wilderness, which is the first full-length novel, as a standalone, because the advice I got from the industry at the time was that series were not wanted and they wanted standalones. But by the time I got to having a contract, they wanted series. And so I had developed series ideas. And what I've done is I've taken the secondary characters from previous books and made them the main characters. And so that's how the books are connected. And as for the actual specific story, it's usually inspired by something I find in history. And in the case of Sing in the Sunlight, which was book 2, it was inspired when I found out about the first female college in the West, which was the Benicia Ladies Seminary, which sounds like it would be a religious school, but it's actually just a college for women. And it's now known as Mills College. I'm sure you've probably heard of it. And so I thought about that as part of the history. I also heard about the 1858 hurricane that touched San Diego, which was the only hurricane to make land in history at the time. Although I think we had a recent event where it might have come close. I have to check if it actually broke the record or not. But at the time, it was the only hurricane to have ever touched the California coast. And so I knew I wanted to incorporate that into a story. And then the third element that really brought that book together was that my heroine has scars, which were caused by something different. But my daughter, actually, when we adopted her, she had a lot of scars from something that happened before we adopted her. And it got me to thinking about how back in the 1800s, there were these laws called the ugly laws. And they would have just ridiculous things. Like if you had some sort of visible deformity, you had to walk on the opposite side of the street. Or, I mean, if you think about like segregation laws, it was kind of along that mentality. It was, oh, you're other, you're different. You have to be away. You have to be not seen. And so I thought about the stigma of a heroine having this visible scars and what it would be like for them to live in that era. Now, I set my book in 1858 because of the hurricane. The actual ugly laws didn't happen for about 10 or 15 years after, but the mentality was still there. And so it was really fun to explore what that was like for that character. And so that's kind of how that book came about. The next one was inspired almost entirely by a scandal that is still discussed to this day when you go on tours of the San Diego school. It's the Mason Street School. It's the first school building that they built in San Diego, and they call it the Mary Walker scandal. And the short version is that the first teacher to teach in that first building was boycotted at one point, and the parents demanded that she be fired. And I'm not going to tell why, but it's very, very applicable to today's culture, as it turned out. And I was kind of nervous when that book came out because I thought people were going to be like, she just made this up to fit the times. And I'm like, no, it just happened to fit. The timing just worked. It was all God, not me. But the really fun part is that the person she ended up marrying, the real historical person, ended up marrying somebody on the school board who was put in the position of deciding whether or not to fire her. And the records from the meeting where they made that decision were lost in a fire. So I got to make it up myself. All we know is that about a month later, she was no longer teaching. And within about 6 months after that, she was married to the member of the board. So, yeah. And I got to read her memoirs and incorporate some of her first impressions of San Diego in the novel. And that was really fun. So Murmur in the Mudcaves is a continuation in that she is the grown-up daughter of some of the characters that you met in the first 3 books. And she reunites so she's an adopted daughter, and she reunites with her birth siblings in this book. And so it was really fun to get to explore my background in adoption, as well as incorporate some of my my experience in going to high school in the high desert. The area where the ranch is set in Murmur in the Mudcaves is set in a mountain desert valley. So it's a valley that's in the mountain in the desert. And so the valley itself is high desert, but then when they come down out of the mountain, they're in the low desert. And then when they go over to Campo, it's almost on the edge of the chaparral area. And so I get to incorporate all these different environments. And then of course, near the end of the book, I incorporate the Mudcaves, which is super fun because a lot of people have never heard of that. And I saw a lot of comments about that in the reviews, and they're all like, I've never heard of it. And it was super interesting, but I don't go there.
Well, and I love that you brought in the concept of adoption, because as Christians, we're all adopted. We're all adopted by God into his family, and we're all now, adopted brothers and sisters of Christ. And I think it's a concept that most of us really struggle with. And so if we stop and think about it, we can relate to the heroine and her concerns with how are people going to perceive me as someone who's adopted, because what does that say about my backstory and my history and where I come from? And many of us, whether or not we actually articulate it, that's something we carry with us as we come into the family of Christ, is we've all got this backstory we don't want anybody to know about, no matter how and when and why we came to Christ. We've all got that, even if we were young children at the time that happened. And so there's something kind of beautiful about that piece of her arc and what happens to her. So why did that become part of her story? How did you know that for her, that was going to be an organic part of her development as a heroine in the story?
So that really comes from my experience in the foster care system and among the adoption community in general. I've heard a lot of stories of people who either felt that their parents saw them as being obligated to be well-behaved and be grateful and so on and so forth. Or I also saw the flip side where the parents were like, no, you don't owe us anything. And the kids were like, yeah, but I feel like I do. Yeah. And so I really wanted to explore that dynamic. And I feel like it really does relate to our relationship with God, because a lot of us, even though we have been saved by faith and not by our works, a lot of the times we feel like, but I need to do something. If I'm not good enough, we may not articulate it, but sometimes deep down, especially those of us with control issues, we want to feel like we contributed something to our own salvation. We want to feel like we deserve it, when the truth is we don't. It was a gift. We did nothing to earn it. And adoption is the same. We being adopted into a family is a gift, as long as it's a healthy family, of course. But it's not one you owe. You don't owe anything. You didn't ask for it. You were given it. But it can be really hard to accept. And so I really enjoyed getting to explore that concept.
I also think with adoption, the flip side of that is, even though adoption there's a choice, your parents actually chose you, your adoptive family went out and sought you, there's still an abandonment issue.
Absolutely.
Every adopted child struggles with abandonment, because in order to be available for adoption, that means even when the birth parents made the most selfless choice possible and said, we can't give you what you need, so we are choosing to make you available so another family can give you what you need. There is something that happens at a soul level that feels like there's abandonment. And so there's this interesting dichotomy that happens with adoption, where there's this, even when it's not, because I do adoptions as an attorney. And so when I say the most heroic people I know are the birth moms and sometimes the birth dads who choose to give up their children. That is a heroic decision.
Oh, absolutely.
As a adopted child, that still feels like abandonment.
Yeah.
And so even when then there's a choice, someone else is stepping in and choosing to take on that responsibility to love you and raise you and adopt you and take on all that that So how does that show up in Biddy's life? Because there's still that too.
Yeah, there is that line too. When I was first talking, I was thinking about her relationship with her adoptive parents, but yeah, there's absolutely the abandonment issue. In her case, her birth mother passed away, and that's how she ended up with her her adoptive parents. But before her birth mother passed away, her father actually took her siblings and disappeared in the middle of the night. And so she never heard from them for 18 years. And so when she finally gets a letter from her big sister saying, hey, I need help, she drops everything and goes to help. And part of her reason for that is she needs answers. She needs to know, why did they leave? What have they been doing this whole time? And you see some of that push and pull and angst in this story. However, because the answers require learning more about what happened to the siblings after they separated from Biddy, you're going to get the full answer in the next two books. So in the next book, you'll learn more about what happened from the brother's point of view. And then in the third book, you'll get the full, complete picture from the big sister's point of view. And
I love that, because it's never a simple answer.
There's it's always layers of gray.
Yeah, there's layers, and life isn't simple, and we want to make it this cut and dry. Yes, no, this happened. It wasn't you, it was me. It was all this, and it's not. There's layers and there's complexity, and we live in a broken world, and there's just that reality. And I love that you're shining a light on that through this book, because adoption is such an important need. And if you go to church, and if you're in a church that has any concept of James 1:27 and caring for the widows and the fatherless, then you're probably aware of, it doesn't take much to know that if every church just took on one child, there wouldn't be a need for foster care and adoption. And so that's something that you and your husband have been part of. So why has that been part of your call and your ministry?
Well, before I get into that, I do want to address one thing that I forgot to mention, which is that in Sing in the Sunlight, I also have a little bit of an adoption thread in there, in that the heroine has a pregnancy out of wedlock and she has to decide whether or not to put the child up for adoption. And so what I do want to say is that for each time I address this issue, I am keeping it unique to the actual situation and the actual characters. And in no way am I ever trying to say, this is the only way to look at it. This is the only way it happens. It's different for everybody. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Well, why has this issue become something that's such a part of who you are and kind of your call?
Okay, right. So when my husband and I were courting, we actually discussed our interest in adoption. And we both agreed before we got married that, yes, we wanted biological children, but we also wanted to adopt at some point. It was just a matter of when and how many. So we went through the biological birth process 3 times. And at the end of that, we said, okay, we're done. We're ready to adopt. And initially we went through considering all the different options. We considered domestic infant, we considered foster care, we just considered international. And for different reasons, based on our situation at the time, we ended up going international, and we chose to pursue a child who was listed for Russia. And we were actually 1 paper away from basically hopping on an airplane and going to meet this child when Russia closed to international adoption from the US. It actually happened on our 11th anniversary. So that was a pretty crappy day. But what it did was it forced us to reconsider all of the options we had previously ruled out. Once it became very clear that Russia was not going to reopen or let us finish our process. And so we ended up getting involved in the foster system. Initially, I was volunteering as a mentor. And well, actually, first I started in the Camp Connect program. So Camp Connect in San Diego County is a program that allows siblings who are placed in separate homes to spend time together in a fun environment, as opposed to being in some sterile room with just supervised visitation. They get to go to Knott's Berry Farm. They get to go to the Japanese garden. They get to go to the aquarium. They get to go play mini golf. They do things, bowling. I mean, you name it. If it's fun, they usually find a way to get those kids there to do it. And it's a great way for those siblings to stay bonded and connected despite their circumstances. And they're separated for a whole variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into. But it's really just such a blessing to see them get to spend time together and see how strong their bonds still are despite everything they're going through. And then from that, I was asked to be a mentor. And so I was a foster youth mentor for a while. And then at one point, while my husband and I were working on getting our foster parenting license, which we had decided to go that route, we were asked to mentor a couple of girls, teenage sisters. And right about the time that we were completing our license, one of the sisters needed a new place to live. And so she ended up coming to live with us. And she stayed with us for a few months, but for reasons connected to her personal story, she ended up having to be placed elsewhere, not by our choice, but not because we did anything wrong. It was just something to do with her. And that ended up being really, really difficult for our biological children, who a couple of them actually blamed themselves for her leaving and had to go to therapy to deal with the emotions of her leaving, because she had been meant to be a permanent foster placement. We had meant to raise her. She was 13. We had meant to raise her through graduation and into college and everything. So they were heartbroken. And we put our license on pause. And after a while, we talked to them about, how would you feel about trying again? And they said, well, we can only do it if you can promise us she'll stay. And so we said, well, that rules out the foster system. So we looked at international again. And I had actually volunteered at an orphanage in China when I was 17. And so China had always kind of appealed to me for that reason. And we ended up going through China to adopt. We also had the financial means and the medical system in place in San Diego to support any child with medical needs, because at the time, China was solely a special needs program. And in fact, our daughter was supposed to have, according to her medical files, she was supposed to have spastic diplegic cerebral palsy. And the miraculous thing is that when we adopted her, she had no neurological problems. Her only health problems had to do with the scars that I mentioned before, which limited mobility in a couple of areas because they were so tight. And she was severely malnourished. Like, I have pictures of like when we got her and like 9 days later, and it's insane that you can see a huge difference in just 9 days. And then if you compare it to like 6 months at home, she's almost unrecognizable as the child that we adopted. It's crazy. And so now if you look at her, she looks like a perfectly healthy, normal little 7-year-old. And we got her when she was 16 months old. Yeah, she's just beautiful. And it was a long 6-year process, but we're very grateful for how it turned out.
Yeah, and I think that's adoption in general. It's a really long but very unique process for many people. And sometimes it's not really long. I do adoptions on the attorney side. And from doing that, I see lots of people's different stories, and it can be very, very unique. But what I love about adoption is how it reflects the story of what God does with each of us. And so I love being part of that, and helping to kind of remove some of the mystery and guide people through the process. And so I love that you have also included it in your books, because that's such an important part of just, again, reflecting our story with God. And so when you look at Gideon and his story, when you look at Bridget and her story in Murmur in the Mudcaves, it's such a rich addition and layer to that. So you've been writing for a while now. What's your favorite part of the writing process?
I think it's the researching and brainstorming phase, because it's so wide open to all the possibilities. And I love diving into history and getting to know these little pockets of tidbits and things that most people don't know about. Like in Murmur in the Mudcaves, I included a actual wagon accident that happened on the actual road leading from San Diego town out into the eastern desert region. And so it's an actual event that actually happened, and I just put my characters in there and had them do it.
I love that. And it is fun when you get to sprinkle in those real things and people are like, that wouldn't happen. Oh yes, and here's the source and the citation, and it's not my brain, I'm just taking it and tweaking it. What's part of the process that drives you a little crazy though?
The formatting and the punctuation, the little nitpicky, like scroll, click, scroll, click, scroll. No, is it done yet? Can we invent AI to fix this for me?
And that's probably coming. I'm hearing more and more
that probably up there somewhere.
I'll help with that kind of stuff.
So I'm very grateful for the proofreaders, that take care of all that. Thank you.
Absolutely, because there are, I'm a really good writer, but there are still things where I'm like, really, I didn't catch that. Okay, well, that's why it's a process. That's why there's a team. And even then, people who'll be like, oh, there were still errors. I'm like, do you realize in an 85,000 word book, even if we're 99.9% accurate, there's going to be a couple of errors that slip through, no matter how many times we look at it. It's just part of, statistical averages. There will be a few things. So when you think about what's coming next, and you've written these 4 books that they're in different parts of California, are you staying in that area? Are you staying historical? What kind of gets you excited as you think about what you might be writing next?
So the thing that connects Chaparral Heart's books is they're all set primarily in San Diego County. And the next 2 books will also do that. The next books that I have in mind to do after this series, I've got a couple of options. I have one book that I've written that's still in San Diego County that involves the gold rush that a lot of people haven't heard of. It actually happened in 1870 in the mountains in San Diego County. Then I have another series idea for it's called the Jackass Trail. It was the mail route that came along to connect the southern part of the U.S. with San Diego and California. It came from that bottom route, which would eventually later on become the Butterfield mail route, the overland mail route. And so I have an idea for that. And then I also have an idea for the overland mail route. And then, of course, now that I'm up here in Central California, and with all my vacations here, I have lots of ideas for involving the events that have happened up here. And so I think I'm probably going to stick with California. There are just so many amazing historical things that could make great stories. There's a school for children that's actually kind of like a juvenile hall / orphanage situation that is what would have been the outskirts of San Francisco at the time. And I have an idea for some girls who went to that school, and then what happens to them afterward and how they're bonded and what they do. And So yeah, I have lots of ideas for California's history. I think that's probably where I'm going to stick for now.
That's awesome. And just hearing your passion for it, I can see all the gears and all the ideas. And you're like, I could write another 40 stories here.
I also have a contract to write a novella for my publisher's Gilded Age series, which will involve the story, what's the word I'm looking for? Legend of a ghost in the Hotel del Coronado. In
How fun.
1892, a woman died of mysterious circumstances, and there's rumors about which way it goes versus the official report. And now to this day, they have books written about her supposed ghost in that area. So I'm not going to be getting into the ghost side of it so much, but I'm going to be getting into that time when she did die and the investigation into it. And so that'll be really fun.
Oh, that sounds like a blast.
Yeah.
And I love the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is just so much fun. And I don't see a lot of the Gilded Age in California. So that would be really, really fun. That sounds like a blast. So where can readers find you? If they're intrigued and they're curious, where's a good place to interact with you and learn more about you and your books?
My website, KathleenDenly.com. As long as you're spelling my last name right, you'll find me on the internet, Denly. I am, to my knowledge, the only person with my name. And so that's very handy. Thank you very much, husband.
Yeah.
But that's a great place to go. You can find out about my newsletter. You can join my Facebook group. You can find about the order of the series, whether it's release date order or chronological order. You can read all of my past book blogging. I did book blogging for like 7 years, I think it was. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff on there.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It was so fun to learn more about your books and your passions and just to be able to introduce readers to you. So if you love, I would say if you're a fan of like Tracie Peterson, Kimberley Woodhouse's historical romances, definitely Misty Baylor, anybody like that who writes kind of the historicals, also probably Karen Witemeyer and folks like that, then you would really enjoy Kathleen Denly's books. The most recent one is Murmurs in Mudcaves, and it's set in California around the 1850s, move a few years in either direction, down in San Diego County. You will definitely enjoy her books. You can learn more at KathleenDenly.com, but you can find her books on Amazon and other places where you enjoy buying your books. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kathleen.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking with you.